Chapter 29. Hang Time. It had been late when they had reached Sun's Blessing, so they hadn't been able to get that much further south when Gaggara commented, "It's beginning to get late, Hanson. I think maybe we should find a place to settle for the night." "I'd like to push on a little further," Reyes requested. "We haven't even reached Borton City yet." "Handsome," Gaggara explained. "If we don't stop soon, our huntresses won't have enough light to see their prey by." "Be nice to see what we're doing, boss," Tanegi offered. So it was only a few miles to the south of Sun's Blessing that the four harpies made camp for the night. As they had the previous night, they took what shelter they could a short way from the King's Highway. Gaggara built the fire while Reyes gathered suitable firewood. Tanegi and Quinnigoff went hunting again, and once again they were able to bring back very little in the way of prey. It was sometime during the middle of the afternoon the following day, with the snow falling thick and fast, when the city of Lufton appeared on the distant horizon. Officially, Lufton was in the dukedom of Borton. However, it had grown so much since it had first been founded that the entire second half of it actually overflowed into the part of the country known as the King's Territory. The distance between Lufton and the human capital was a little over 50 miles as the harpy flies. Reyes was certain that so long as they had no distractions, he and his companions would be taking perches on the rooftops of the houses overlooking First Town's harbour wall no later than that very evening. From those positions they would be able to see the short distance across the water to the island of Arlis and their eventual goal. Lufton was also the first city that Reyes had seen since leaving the encampment that wasn't buried in a thick blanket of snow. The change in the weather had happened quite abruptly. Somewhere between the cities of Borton and Lufton, one second the landscape in all directions had been covered in snow for as far as the eye could see. The next, Reyes caught sight of something green on the horizon. From then on, the further south the four of them flew, the greener the distant land seemed to become. It was as if the caster had drawn an imaginary line across the land, decreeing that everything to the north of that line should be covered in ice, snow, and perpetual winter, while everything to the south should be cradled in the warmth and beauty of a virtually endless summer, lush green vegetation, complete with its well-fed animals frolicking in the relative heat, and the plants, many of whom would usually be dormant this time of year, raising their heads in glory to the sun. Despite knowing it was there, the sudden change in temperature when Reyes flew across the line still came as quite a shock to him. One second he had been shivering with the cold, and the next he was across the line and his body was being heated as if by the sun on a hot summer's afternoon. Despite the fact that it was now winter, the cold that had been permeating his very being seemed to melt, and it was replaced by a feeling of comfort and contentment. "Oh," Gaggara cried out in pleasure as they crossed the line. "Feels good," Tanegi added when she too crossed the line a moment or two later. Reyes couldn't help himself. Magic had always fascinated him, and magic this powerful was just something he couldn't bring himself to ignore. Besides, he was only just beginning to feel the benefits of the heat. It would be nice to take a short break before continuing. "I'm going to take a closer look." "Handsome," Gaggara called after him worriedly. Reyes flew down to the ground, being careful not to fly back across the line as he did so. He really didn't want to be subject to that cold again. He landed gently on the summer side of the demarcation and began to examine it the best he could. It was strange. It was definitely strange. Clearly this was proof that magic had to be involved. Certainly this wouldn't be an effect of nature, yet there was no blue glow suggesting the magic had been deployed here. The snow on the northern side of the line was at least a couple of feet thick. Reyes could also see that it was still snowing there, yet regardless of what angle the snow fell at on the northern side of the line, not a single flake seemed to make its way to the south. It just piled up on the north as if the snow was resting against a flat piece of glass. "We should press on," Gaggara commented. She had landed just behind him, her head tilted slightly to the side. Reyes glanced round to address her. "I want to test one more thing, then we can go." "We should go," Gaggara insisted. Reyes glanced back once more at the demarcation between winter and summer, and then decided that Gaggara was right. He could spend hours trying to investigate the kind of magic that had been used here, and he would probably still learn very little. It would take a major Mangloss's skill to even begin to understand how this worked. He then launched himself back into the air. While they had been stopped, Quinnigoff and Tanegi had taken perches in the lush, vibrant branches of a couple of trees not too far away, but trees that offered an excellent outlook of the surrounding countryside. As soon as Reyes indicated that he was ready to continue, Quinnigoff took to the air and began to continue their flight to the south. She did look over her shoulder a couple of times to check that Reyes and Gaggara were behind her, but other than that, she concentrated on what lay ahead. During the invasion, the city of Lufton had been pretty much caught sleeping. The elven army had marched straight through the open gates of the city and had conquered it with next to no resistance. It had almost been as if the population of the city had gotten so complacent because they were so far south of the Elven border that they simply didn't believe they would ever be at risk. The Luftonians had made up for it. The militia had banded together after the fact, and during his last visit, Reyes had seen evidence of them trying to get as many of the population out of the city to a place of safety as they could. That had been more than 4 months ago, and Reyes couldn't help but wonder how the people of Lufton were doing now. The streets of the city were crowded once again. Humans of both sexes and all ages milled about the streets. They wore no chains to indicate their status as slaves, but Reyes had little doubt that they had been imported from the rest of the country to make life that much easier for the elves who chose to live here. Humans weren't the only ones using the streets of the city. Reyes flew over a lot of elves and even noticed 1 or 2 minotaurs and a handful of goblins. Lufton was an important city. It was the gateway to the capital, and it led Reyes to wonder what kind of population mix might be awaiting them when he and his companions finally arrived. It wasn't just humans, elves, goblins and minotaurs though. There were harpies in the skies of the city. Now, true, there didn't seem to be a lot of them, no more than 1 or 2 villages scattered about the entire city, but they were there. Most of the harpies were just perched in small groups on the rooftops of the various buildings about the city, chatting together about the things that interested them, or they were making unflattering remarks about someone who just happened to be passing in the street below. Occasionally one of them would glance toward Reyes or one of his companions, but they rarely bothered with a second look. "It's too busy here," Quinnigoff complained to no one in particular. "I'm beginning to think we should have given this city a miss." "Too late now," Reyes told her. "Just follow the road and act like nothing's wrong." Reyes couldn't help but feel that Quinnigoff was right though. This city was far too crowded, and it didn't have the benefit of the sky-bound police force that cities such as Goldspawn seemed to possess. More than once, Reyes caught sight of a pair of harpies squabbling on some rooftop. Whenever he did, he always kept his eyes pinned on the road below, or the sky ahead, and did his best not to even glance at the combatants for fear of attracting their unwanted ire. Down in the streets of the city, things were rarely any better. More than once he saw a fight between a pair of elves, and on one occasion he saw a gang of thugs approach and rob a civilian in broad daylight, with many others nearby all trying to ignore what was happening. Reyes had never liked the eyes in the sky, but in a city of elves he was beginning to see why they were so important. The city was a very noisy place. The elves were constantly chatting with each other. Sometimes they were shouting for each other, and on occasion even shouting obscenities at each other. The one thing that Reyes found surprising was that he could understand a lot of what was being said. The language being used was predominantly Alistrain. Cities on the south end of the country, such as First Town and Lufton, had originally been conquered by the army of Cassitella, brought across the sea by the Duberan navy. Cassitellan was a totally different language than Alistrain, so it felt strange that Reyes didn't hear more being spoken in a language he didn't understand. Slowly, it occurred to him that although the army was probably still of Cassitellan origin, most of the actual colonists had most likely moved here from Alistrain. It was easier to cross a few hundred miles of snow-covered land than it was to charter a boat, especially for an elf in the middle of a war. Not everyone in the streets of the city was speaking Alistrain, but it did seem to be the predominant language. The King's Highway continued south towards the city centre, neatly bisecting the city into 2 halves. If he looked down, Reyes could see his shadow large and impressive below him, and trailing a short distance behind. He was quite taken by surprise when he heard a cry from somewhere up ahead. Not that it was unusual for someone to be crying out. It was the words that were shouted that took Reyes by surprise. They were spoken clearly and proudly, and as loud as the speaker could possibly manage, in flourish. "Long live the king!" Almost immediately there followed a sudden ka-chunk noise. Reyes recognised that sound. He had heard it several times when he was living in Goldspawn, but the time he remembered most was the day when he had first heard it in Lamington. It was the distinctive sound of gallows, a trapdoor having been opened, and 1 or more people dropping a few feet to his, her, or their death. The gallows was located just up ahead from where Reyes heard it, in the old central market square, just a little to the north of the very centre of the city. Most of the shops here were closed. The original human owners had fled the area, and in many cases they hadn't even locked their doors behind them. Locked or not, the elves had come in and destroyed the shop fronts, smashing the windows and tearing down the signs, looting the shops for anything and everything. Elves had since moved into some of the buildings. They had renovated them as best they could, and were now trying to tout their own wares. But there seemed to be little interest in anything they had to offer. Everyone was too busy watching the executions. The gallows itself was a fairly simple design and was capable of hanging 3 people at a time. 2 men and a woman, all human, were dangling from the 3 ropes as Reyes first caught sight of the scene. He landed on the rooftop of one of the shops overlooking the scene and tried to take it all in. One of the men currently hanging was wearing an old and tattered uniform of the Lufton militia. Most likely he had been the one who had cried out. The other 2 were wearing clothing that marked them out as peasants. A large crowd had gathered in front of the gallows. They seemed to be enjoying the spectacle of seeing 3 humans being executed. The gallows wasn't the only thing in the market square that caught Reyes' eye. Sitting on the far side of the gallows from Reyes' vantage point was a cart with 2 horses at its front. At most, the cart could be no more than 3 feet wide, although it was easily 6 feet long. The cart had steep sides, so things could be loaded onto it quite high without there being any risk of them falling off, even when travelling over the bouncy cobbled streets. In the driver's seat of the cart was a bored-looking elf in the uniform of the new Lufton militia. Occasionally he would glance over at the gallows itself, but it wasn't enough to hold his attention. In the back of his cart were the bodies of 6 previous victims of the gallows, while standing right behind the cart were 2 more elven soldiers who Reyes assumed were there to do the loading. On the other side of the gallows was a large wooden stockade. The gaps between the bars were wide enough that any elves who wished could throw rotten fruit or vegetables at those awaiting their fate inside. Reyes estimated that there were still about 20 prisoners in the stockade, a liberal mix of men and women of all ages, the youngest being a girl who could be no more than 9 or 10 years old at the most. She was wearing a relatively pretty dress, but like everyone else in the stockade, the dress had aged over the last 4 months, as if it had been the only thing she had worn. Most of the other inmates of the stockade appeared to be peasants, but Reyes could see at least 4 of the men wearing the uniform of the Lufton militia. Quinnigoff had been leading the way, and Gaggara was evidently deep enough in her own thoughts that neither of them noticed immediately that Reyes had taken a perch on one of the rooftops. Tanegi, on the other hand, saw him stop in plenty of time to take a perch on the same rooftop, not all that far away. She had a look of grim determination on her face as she checked the area for potential danger. Not that Reyes even realised she was there. He was too concerned with the scene below. Gaggara soon noticed that Reyes was no longer with her. She doubled back and circled the rooftop where he was perched once before coming into land. "What is it, Hanson?" "I can't let this go," Reyes replied. He looked worriedly towards his wife and then back at the scene below. "What?" Gaggara seemed a little confused at first. Then she looked down and seemed to notice what was happening. Even then she seemed a little uncertain as to why Reyes should care. Tanegi then made the comment, "I don't mean to tell you your business, boss, but it's just a small handful of humans. If you help them, you might end up putting your mission in jeopardy." "They're dying," Reyes replied simply. "It's war, boss. People die," Tanegi remarked. Reyes sighed. He began to formulate a plan in his mind. He would jump down into the streets below, summon his horse, summon his armour, summon his sword, and ride like a human knight into the elven crowd. There would be panic. He could use that panic. In a marvel of sword-fighting expertise that had never been seen in the history of Lufton before, he would then single-handedly take on the might of the elven militia. He would kill the hang-elf and then the other guards that were on the platform. He would kill the soldiers standing guard over by the stockade, fend off those currently holding the crowds at bay, free the prisoners, and then what? The market square was at the very centre of the city. If he and the prisoners fled in any direction, they would have a long way to run. How far were they likely to get? How long would it be before every elf became alerted to their escape attempt? He might survive. His armour was strong and might even fend off arrows at close range. Somehow, though, he doubted that many of the prisoners would make it out safely. It would only take one arrow, fired by a harpy, to penetrate his armour, for Reyes to have a very bad day. Reyes rejected the idea almost immediately. Even if he got Gaggara, Quinnigoff and Tanegi to give him air support, it wouldn't help much. Most likely it would just end up with all 4 of them dead, along with the humans he was trying to rescue. Besides, one of the main reasons why Reyes had considered charging in as a human was to earn the trust of the prisoners, to make them think that he was one of them. If he charged in with harpies watching his back, how could he ever make them trust him? "She gets like this," Gaggara explained to Tanegi. It almost seemed as if she was apologising for him. "The 2 of us liberated an entire village once, just because some of them were going to be executed the following day. This is the same sort of thing." "Come on, my chief," Quinnigoff urged, having finally caught wind of the fact that the others weren't following her, and having returned to fetch them. "There's nothing you can do." Reyes sighed and nodded. It was already too late for the 3 currently dangling from the gallows. One of the soldiers standing on the platform was now removing the nooses from their latest victims and letting the bodies drop unceremoniously to the ground. Well, Race thought to himself, he might not be able to save those who had died, but maybe he could do something about the others. He left his perch and flew down to the stockade. Handsome, Gaggara said worriedly. Follow, Race called back. I have an idea. There was a short gasp of fear from the prisoners as Race landed on one of the top bars of the fence that enclosed them. He looked them over briefly as if contemplating them as a commodity, acting as much like a harpy as he could. There were 3 elves at the stockade. 2 of them were armed with spears and shields, and each carried a backup sword. The third was clearly the one in charge, and it was he who spoke. He spoke in Cassitellan, and Race didn't understand a word. What? Race commented. I said, hey you, get down from there, damn harpies. Race was hit by a strong feeling of relief. The elf was bilingual. He spoke Elistran. He had been worried that he might have had to conduct his business using Quinagoth or Tanegi as his mouthpiece. Race hopped down off the fence and landed beside the elf. How much? He pointed his thumb back towards the prisoners. What? The elf almost stammered in surprise. Gaggara landed on the fence of the stockade and then jumped down next to her husband. Race didn't see where Quinagoth and Tanegi went, but he had the feeling that they couldn't be too far away. For the prisoners, Race explained. How much? Race pulled the money bag out of his ring and let it dangle alluringly in his hand. You want to buy the prisoners? The elf said. Even now the elf seemed very confused, as if he wasn't sure what Race was asking. I do, Race clarified. I've seen what you're doing. You're executing them for the pleasure of the locals. It might be fun, but it's a waste of good meat. I want to buy those you have left. Human flesh is a great delicacy among my people. There was a gasp from one of the prisoners. It seemed that at least one of them understood the language. Gaggara couldn't help but giggle. Then she licked her lips. Hey, someone in the crowd shouted. What's going on? Keep that harpy out of here, and let's show some more hangings. Yeah, echoed another. I'll sell their corpses once they've been executed, the elf said calmly. I can't let you have the prisoners before then. No deal, Race countered quickly. We don't eat that which we haven't hunted for ourselves. If it's already dead, then it's of no value to us. The elf seemed to be sizing Race up for a moment. It's hardly hunted if I've sold them to you. Race grinned and said, You define hunting your way, I'll define it mine. At the end of the day, if we don't do it my way, you don't get the money. There was a lot of jeering from the crowd. How much money are we talking about here? The elf asked. It's not just me, you know. There were nearly 30 of us here, and everyone will want to share. 30 pieces of silver then? Race offered. 1 for each of you? No deal, the elf replied tersely. Now, get out of here. I have a job to do. Race hesitated and then he suggested, what if I was to make it a single gold coin instead? That has to be worth more than 3 times the 30 silver, don't you think? Race put his hand in the bag and pulled out a golden coin. The elf's mouth gaped open. There were a number of gasps at the sight of those in the crowd. Even those at the stockade seemed more than a little surprised to see such a valuable coin. Gold was extremely rare at the best of times, but to be in the possession of a harpy... Let me see that, the elf said. Race laid the coin carefully on the elf's palm and then stated as if it was a fact, The prisoners are mine now. Not so fast, the elf said, examining the coin closely. This is real, isn't it? It is, Race told him in a reassuring tone. Where does a harpy get gold? The elf asked. Our village is located, Race started to say. Does it matter? Gaggara interrupted. I guess not, the elf replied. Give us the meat, Gaggara pressed, playing along. Hey, one of the prisoners commented. I think I understood that. Me too, claimed another, though I wish I hadn't. Hey, someone from the crowd complained. I came here specially to see some executions. You can't just... There were many other jeers and catcalls along the same lines. These are my prisoners, the elf guard shouted back at the crowd. I'll do what I like with them. Then from the scaffold, the hang-elf shouted something in Cassitellan. Race didn't understand the words, but he got the gist. The elf was getting impatient. The elf guard shouted something back, and then he looked Race in the face. You hear them? I'll be the one who gets lynched if I don't go ahead with the hangings. Race nodded, and then pulled a second golden coin from his money bag. Are you sure? The elf said. Then he smiled, grabbed the coin and announced to the crowd, The rest of the day's entertainment has been cancelled. Thank you for your patronage, and I'm sure we'll have some more for you next week. You can't be serious, one of the crowd commented. It wasn't the elves in the crowd who were the biggest threat to the elf Race had just done business with. One of the other guards at the stockade cleared his throat, while the other looked on with interest, and said in Elistran, I assume we all get an equal share of that. We will all share one of the coins, but I conducted the deal. I get... Race didn't stay long enough to listen. The internal squabbles of the elven militia were of no interest to him. He walked slowly over to the gate and opened it. Then he looked at the humans cowering inside the wooden walls, acting as if he didn't care how scared they were. He stared at them menacingly, still playing the part of the conqueror, and he indicated brusquely that they should leave the stockade. No one moved. Somewhere, one of the prisoners, a woman, started to cry. Reyes couldn't help but notice that the young girl didn't even look frightened. Elsewhere in the stockade, Reyes could hear someone repeating over and over again, "They're going to eat us. They're going to eat us." Had he wanted to, Reyes could communicate with these people easily, but he felt it best not to display too many of his abilities with so many elves nearby. Instead, he picked out the woman that had overheard his conversation with the elves. "Tell your friends to follow me." "Why should I?" she said defiantly. "You're going to eat us anyway. Do as I say, and maybe we'll save you until last," Reyes said with a growl in his voice. "Do my bidding well, we might even let you go." "Come," the little girl said. It was almost as if she was considering herself to be in charge. "This creature has brought us and wishes us to follow her. Whatever fate may await us, it has to be better than choking to death at the end of a rope." "They're going to eat us," someone commented again. "You see," said one of the other women in the stockade. "You see how regally she holds herself? You can see how even impending death doesn't scare her. I tell you, this is your queen now. Perhaps you'll believe in her just before we're eaten." The young girl led the way out of the stockade.